The biggest change in U.S.-China relations is not that the competition has disappeared. It is that the competition has become much harder to control. For decades, Washington preferred to separate issues. Trade could be discussed as trade. Technology could be handled as technology. Security could be managed through military alliances. Energy could be treated as a Middle East issue. Taiwan could be placed in a separate strategic category. That separation is now much harder to maintain. Iran affects energy prices. Energy prices affect inflation. Trade affects manufacturing costs. Manufacturing costs affect American consumers. Rare earths affect electric vehicles, aerospace, defense production, and semiconductors. Taiwan affects security in the Western Pacific, but also the global chip supply chain and financial market expectations. This is the central reality of today's U.S.-China relationship. Different issues are now connected through the same global system. When American and Chinese leaders sit down for talks, the agenda can no longer stop at tariffs or trade deficits. Iran, nuclear arms control, artificial intelligence, agricultural purchases, rare earths, Taiwan, and supply chain stability all belong to the same strategic conversation. That does not mean the United States is no longer competing with China. It clearly is. Washington continues to use export controls, industrial policy, investment restrictions, technology limits, tariffs, and security partnerships to protect its position. But the tools that once gave the United States broad flexibility now come with higher costs and more complicated trade-offs. The problem for Washington is not simply China's rise. The problem is that China has become deeply embedded in the global industrial system. Take Iran as an example. The United States has long described China as its primary strategic competitor. Yet when tensions rise in the Middle East, when energy markets become unstable, and when regional escalation threatens global prices, China becomes difficult to ignore. China is one of the world's largest energy importers. It is also a major trading partner for many countries in the Middle East. Whether Washington likes it or not, Beijing has influence in conversations about energy, diplomacy, and regional stability. This is not a sudden change in U.S. policy. It is a recognition of reality. If oil prices rise sharply, American inflation could return. If inflation rises, the Federal Reserve, consumer confidence, business costs, and presidential politics all come under pressure. Geopolitics becomes domestic economics. That is why the U.S.-China relationship is no longer just about foreign policy. It is about prices, factories, shipping routes, capital markets, and voters. Rare earths make this even clearer. The United States can talk about reducing dependence on China. It can encourage new mining projects, alternative suppliers, and domestic processing capacity. But rebuilding a critical minerals supply chain is not easy, fast, or cheap. Materials such as yttrium, scandium, indium, and neodymium may not be familiar to most consumers, but they are highly important for advanced manufacturing. They are linked to heat-resistant coatings for aerospace engines, chipmaking, communication technologies, electric vehicles, defense systems, and precision manufacturing. A car factory, an aircraft supplier, a defense contractor, or a semiconductor equipment producer may all depend on materials that sit far upstream in the supply chain. So, when Washington talks about rare earth shortages, it is not talking about a small trade problem. It is talking about a vulnerability inside the industrial system. This is why the U.S. Defense Department's first National Defense Industrial Strategy matters. The strategy focused on supply chain resilience, workforce readiness, procurement efficiency, and critical stockpiles. That language tells us something important. Modern power is not measured only by aircraft carriers, fighter jets, and missiles. It is also measured by workers, minerals, machine tools, inventory, shipping capacity, production lines, and supplier networks. Military power rests on industrial power. Industrial power rests on supply chains. If key minerals are unavailable, if defense companies lack components, if shipbuilding and aerospace production cycles become too long, then even a large defense budget faces real-world limits. That is the contradiction at the heart of U.S. policy toward China. Washington wants to limit China's technological rise. It wants to de-risk supply chains. It wants to preserve military advantages and strengthen alliances. At the same time, it needs stable prices, stable industrial inputs, stable markets, and stable corporate planning. Pressure and stability are now operating inside the same policy. Taiwan shows the same dynamic. In the mid-1990s, the United States used carrier battle groups to signal military presence during a period of tension in the Taiwan Strait. That was a different era. The U.S. Navy had far more room to operate, and China's military capabilities were much more limited than they are today. 30 years later, the environment is very different. China's Navy, Air Force, missile forces, reconnaissance systems, long-range strike capabilities, and regional denial capacity have improved significantly. The Western Pacific is no longer a space where the United States can set the tempo alone. American carriers can still move. But the risks after movement are higher. Supply lines, base security, missile threats, allied political tolerance, and market reactions all have to be calculated in advance. That helps explain why the United States has long maintained strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. The Taiwan Relations Act requires the United States to provide Taiwan with defensive articles and maintain the capacity to resist coercion. But it does not automatically require the United States to enter a war. Washington has always tried to balance commitment, deterrence, and the fear of being pulled into a conflict it cannot fully control. War games make the dilemma even more visible. In some simulated scenarios, the United States and its partners may be able to prevent a major amphibious invasion. But the cost would be extremely high. Ships, aircraft, personnel, fiscal capacity, allied confidence. Taiwan's economy and the semiconductor supply chain could all suffer major damage. The most important question is not who advances on a map. The real question is whether a military outcome creates a strategic gain. After a conflict, what happens to markets? What happens to debt? What happens to alliances? What happens to chip production? What happens to domestic public opinion? None of these are small questions. That is why Washington's current China strategy looks increasingly like a system of pressure across many fronts. Tariffs must be negotiated. Chips must be controlled. AI must be restricted. Rare earths must remain stable. Taiwan must remain a point of influence. The South China Sea and the Philippines matter for military presence. The Middle East cannot be allowed to push energy prices out of control. Every line applies pressure. But every line also carries risk if it breaks. This is the core reality of U.S. China relations today. The United States remains powerful. But China is no longer an opponent that can be redirected through a single tool. China's position is not based only on low-cost manufacturing. It is based on industrial depth, market scale, critical materials processing, infrastructure capacity, and economic relationships across the global South. For Washington, that means China policy cannot rely only on sanctions, tariffs, and military presence. For Beijing, it means the long game matters more than any single headline. The real competition is becoming a comparison of systems. Who can stabilize supply chains? Who can control costs? Who can upgrade industry? Who can absorb external shocks? Who can give markets a sense of long-term stability? Who can avoid strategic mistakes? The future of U.S.-China relations is unlikely to be a clean decoupling. It is also unlikely to return to the old model of broad engagement. The more likely outcome is high-pressure coexistence. Competition and negotiation at the same time. Restrictions and dependence at the same time. Military caution and economic necessity at the same time. That is why the United States can no longer simply avoid China, not because Washington does not want to compete. It does, but because the cost of ignoring China has become too high. Trade, rare earths, energy, artificial intelligence, Taiwan, supply chains, and financial markets now connect the world's two largest economies in ways that neither side can fully escape. The United States will continue to apply pressure. China will continue to respond and adapt. But the direction of this rivalry may not be decided by one summit, one tariff round, or one military exercise. It may be decided by something slower and more important: industrial resilience, market stability, strategic patience, and the ability to manage risk without losing control. The United States has not withdrawn from competition. China is not returning to an era when outside powers could easily set the terms. That is the real shift. U.S.-China relations are no longer just a diplomatic story between two governments. They are now one of the central variables shaping global supply chains, global capital, global manufacturing, and global security. The world should not only watch who sounds tougher. It should watch who can absorb pressure longer, who can manage complexity better, and who can compete without triggering a crisis that damages everyone. This is no longer just a trade war. It is a supply chain contest, a technology contest, a resource contest, and a test of strategic endurance.